Bom dia a todas e todos que nos acompanham. Sejam bem-vindos ao nosso segundo encontro de Corruptione. É, é um grupo de pesquisa, como todos sabem, que tenta estudar a corrupção numa perspectiva política. É um grupo realmente de pesquisa em que os membros se encontram com muita frequência, trocam ideias e, sobretudo, trocam problemas. O grupo tem a página na internet, que eu imagino que vocês conheçam, onde a gente tenta colocar um pouco da nossa produção, das nossas pesquisas, e eu tenho a alegria de dizer que hoje mesmo estamos lançando as atas da nossa segunda jornada, porque nas estratégias do nosso grupo, nós costumamos fazer um encontro internacional a cada 2 anos e fazer uma jornada também, portanto, em anos alternados, uma jornada de trabalhos internos. Então, este encontro que se inicia hoje tem esse caráter de encontro mais amplo, portanto, temos um interesse enorme em ouvir vocês, mas, como eu dizia, acaba de sair ontem, publicado, já está na nossa página, as atas da segunda jornada, que ocorreu no início deste ano. As atas foram organizadas pela Clarice Aguiar, pela Camila Cardoso, pela Isabela Alves, da USP, que faz parte também do De Corruptione. Então, convido a todas e todos que deem uma olhada nessas atas, onde também está o nosso trabalho. Bom, a partir de agora, vou então passar, que é o que mais interessa agora nesta manhã, a apresentação do professor Charles West. Charles West is professor of medieval history at University of Edinburgh in Scotland, where he arrived in 2023 after 15 years teaching at University of Sheffield in England. His research is mostly on the history of Carolingian and post-Carolingian Europe. He has recently published a new book on the great divorce struggle of King Lothar II, and is now finishing a book on 10th century local priests as part of an Anglo-German collaborative project under contract with Cambridge University Press. He became interested in simony and corruption through encountering the work of the monk Humberto da Silva Cândida as a PhD student, and he has recently published an article in the Journal of Ecclesiastical History revisiting the origins of the panic about simony in the 11th century. When we started preparing for this meeting, esse segundo encontro de Corruptione, and thinking about researchers whose work had been part of our group's discussions, Leandro Rust and I immediately thought of Professor Charles West. At the beginning of the year, we read and discussed his article, The Simony Crisis of the 11th Century and the Letter of Guido, which certainly helped us to broaden the semantic field of corruption. We wrote to Professor West, who replied quickly, kindly, and generously, accepting the invitation to give the opening lecture. After exchanging a few ideas, he was willing to accept the challenge of speaking to us more directly about the problem with the title Corruption in the Middle Ages and the Problem of Simony. Professor West, I give you the floor, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you very much, Filomena, for that generous introduction, and thank you everybody who is here online. It's a great honor, actually, to be taking part in this network about corruption, which I know has been going since 2019, and the program suggests you have a fabulous few days ahead of you, right? It looks really exciting, so that's brilliant. So my title for this paper is Corruption in the Middle Ages and the Problem of Simony. And I meant this title in two senses. So the first and most obvious meaning is that simony, as a form of corruption, was perceived as a problem by contemporaries in medieval Europe. So that's, in a sense, that is one meaning of my title. I think most of you will know already that simony is broadly defined as the illicit purchase of or the sale of ecclesiastical office and of things connected to that office. So the anxiety around simony, this illicit purchase or sale of ecclesiastical office, intensified markedly in the 11th century in association with the so-called Gregorian reform movement of the papacy, and with special intensity from the 1050s onwards, when it began to take quite a central place in debates about the papacy and about the church. At least that's what I've argued elsewhere in the article which Philomena just referred to, although other historians prefer to see this particular phase starting a little bit earlier, maybe in the 1030s. But of course, simony does have a history which is much, much older than that. The notion of simony as a special kind of heresy associated with the biblical figure of Simon Magus goes back to Pope Gregory the Great in the 6th century, so the late 6th century. And Pope Gregory the Great very famously identifies 3 routes or pathways of simony, which is to say acquiring church office through gifts or through favour or through flattery, although he emphasised they're all bad. But of course the twist here is that gift exchange was a fundamental part of post-Roman social norms and mores. To demand that appointment to a prestigious office should not be accompanied with tangible demonstrations of appreciation and gratitude cut very deeply across established social expectations. And that meant that the complete elimination of simony was more or less impossible. And that actually is what made it so effective and productive as a concept, I think. It wasn't something which could ever be solved. It was a moral norm that was both urgent and unachievable, both essential and always out of reach. And that meant it was very valuable as a potential weapon to use against one's enemies. And indeed, we know of at least 100 named people who were accused of being simoniacs in the 10th and 11th centuries. So this was a weapon which certainly was used. So, corruption in the Middle Ages and the problem of simony, that is the first sense in which simony was a problem. An action or a label for an action which was acknowledged as bad, as a misdemeanor, but that was also in reality a categorization of an aspect of normal and deeply anchored social interactions. So all this is quite well known. There is room for much more work, of course, but this is just laying the background, I suppose. But when I talk about the problem of simony, I also have a second, more methodological sense at the back of my mind. And this is the way in which simony is a problem or an opportunity, perhaps, for how we think about corruption today. And this is actually what I'm going to focus on in this paper. Now, it seems to me that most general historical accounts of corruption are secularist. And by this, I mean that they define corruption through ideas of modernization and of the modern state. They prioritize public office, and in doing so, they explicitly or implicitly discount the church and religion from their interpretations. Now, let me give you an example of what I mean. I'm going to highlight a recently published book published by a historian called Mark Knights. Let me see if I can get the slide to work. There we go. This book is about corruption in the early modern England. And I want to begin actually by recommending this book if you've not read it already. It's very stimulating. And if I suggest there are some problems in his account or in his approach, I do so in recognition that this is a very important and long-awaited work, which makes a major contribution, for instance, in integrating the British Empire into works about corruption. In this book, he argues very strongly that English ideas about corruption were developed in the context of the East India Company in particular, and then kind of spread from there. So it's a very interesting book. But what strikes the medieval historian when reading this book is the basic contrast it is framed around. And this is not this is you find this in other books as well. Okay, so this is it's very clear, I think, but it's not unique to this book. Here is the book's central pivot, and the quotes are on the screen in front of you. In 1600, he says, corruption was primarily seen in religious terms, meaning original sin or sinful behaviour. By 1850, corruption tended to mean financial and political corruption, embezzlement or abuse of public funds, venality, the abuse of office for private gain, breach of trust. Corruption had acquired, he says, a more specific sense closely related to office. So Mark Knight's book is telling a story then of how corruption moves from a vague background religious sense to a more specific foregrounded secular meaning. Now, in many ways, I think the distinction here between a vague religious sense of corruption and a specific meaning associated with public office is very useful. It's very interesting. There are many approaches to corruption, and in this conference, over the next few days, we'll be hearing more about several of them. But focusing on public office is useful because it helps us distinguish corruption from other forms of abuse of power. And other forms of injustice, which maybe makes comparison and inquiry actually easier. Not all abuse of power is corruption, after all. And in fact, Knight goes a little bit further than that, and he builds on some recent research which frames corruption as the abuse of entrusted power. So power which has been given to you with strings attached, so to speak. It's power which has been entrusted to you for you to do something specific with it. So really part of the story he's telling here is how office, holding office, becomes reimagined as entailing responsibilities as well as capacity and ability and power. But as these quotations show, there is also a secularizing tendency here, by which I mean the discounting of religious perspectives on corruption. Corruption, for Knight, I think, only really becomes interesting, only really becomes developed when it passes into the secular sphere and becomes associated with public and state office. What about religious office? Well, Knight does mention this, in fact, but only briefly and only to exclude it. The quote is here on the screen. Religious office, he says, is another category that has an interesting history in which accusations of corruption were made. But lack of space means it will only be tangentially treated in what follows. And by the way, this comment is tucked into a footnote. It is literally marginal to the book he is writing because it's marginal, I suppose, to the story he is telling. So while the sharp focus on corruption as relating to the abuse of entrusted public office in relation then to the state or public authority is in some ways helpful, it has two much less helpful side effects. Firstly, it does nothing to challenge or address the marginalisation of the Middle Ages in this context, a time which in the Middle Ages supposedly, of course, predates the public state. And until surprisingly recently, in fact, the 1990s, really, there really wasn't that much work on corruption in the Middle Ages. And here I point you to Leandro Rust's recent historiographical account, where he calls the history at this point una historia en branco. Okay, so there just wasn't much written until the 1990s. It is often noted that there is no medieval word for bribe. It is often noted that gift exchange was a fundamental part of how medieval society works. And actually, I just made that point myself a few moments ago. And this links in turn to a long tradition of seeing medieval power as auto-legitimizing, as unaccountable. And this is often expressed in English through the term lordship, French seigneurie and so forth. And the fundamental meaning of lordship, and actually of seigneurie and all these other words, Herrschaft in German, the fundamental meaning here is to describe a form of power which is not office, which is distinct from office, and in which there is no conceptual room, therefore, for corruption. Lordship is, in a way, seen as corrupt power already. Looking for corruption in the Middle Ages, in this perspective, is like looking for abuse of power in the workings of drug cartels. You won't find it because it's the water you swim through, so to speak. But of course, we know that's not true. As a matter of empirical fact, we know there was, of course, corruption, or more accurately, accusations of corruption in the Middle Ages, referring also to secular government. Let me give you three brief examples of this. In the year 433, so at the very beginning of the Middle Ages, Bishop Cyril of Alexandria mounted an amazing campaign to try to bribe the imperial court in Constantinople to win their backing in a dispute about theology. To this end, he sent nearly a metric ton of gold to 19 named office holders with very careful tabulations as to who gets what. And by the way, along with the gold, there went carpets and also ostrich eggs. The gold probably represented several years' worth of the revenues of the bishopric of Alexandria. This is a very, very substantial bribe. Of course, the gifts are not labelled as bribes, they're labelled as gifts. But bribes is clearly what they were. And interestingly, the gifts catalogue which we have is transmitted to us today, or was transmitted in the Middle Ages, through texts linked to Cyril's enemies, not to Cyril himself or his supporter. This was not a text which Cyril was distributing. It was a text which his enemies were sending around. Lavish gift giving to win over important opinion was completely normal, of course, in late Roman society behind the scenes, but it was still damaging and embarrassing to publicize it. Moving on, around the year 800, there is the notorious complaint in the form of a poem by Bishop Theodulf of Orleans in Carolingian Francia, where Theodulf describes the various attempts that were made to win favourable judgments from judges and hints that other judges were less scrupulous about accepting gifts than he was. And I know that both Lorenzo Paveggio and Tiago Juarez Ribeira da Silva will be talking more about Theodulf of Orleans later in this conference. So I'm just mentioning Theodulf now. And third, in the 13th century, I think of the work of William Chester Jordan on King Louis IX of France and his dedicated anti-corruption campaigns intended to ensure better governance for his subjects, in part through better and more accountable record keeping, in part through prohibiting councillors from accepting gifts, which he did in 1254, and in part just by paying good salaries. So, the abuse of entrusted power is perfectly visible before 1600. These abuses were not always labelled as corruption, using the Latin word corruptio, of course, or any other equivalent, directly equivalent word, but the concept is nevertheless clearly there. We can't just pursue the study of corruption, after all, by doing a search and find for the word corruptio. That won't get us very far. I don't need to dwell on this point anymore for this audience. I know we're going to be hearing more investigations in this field throughout the rest of this conference, with reference to the Fuero Real and Alfonso X's Especulo, for example. My point is simply that, in fact, there was a good deal of what was recognisably corruption in Western Europe in the Middle Ages, and here I know I am preaching to the converted. But there is a second point, and this is what is the key point for this paper, which is that the secularizing drive of much modern corruption historiography overlooks and actually obscures a key site for discussion about and debate about corruption, and a key driver for ideas about corruption, which was the church, not the state. As an illustration of this point, let me turn briefly to church councils. Oh, too far. There we go. Now, church councils were, of course, a key, essential part of the running of the church. Church councils, where bishops came together to discuss and to pray, created networks of bishops, and they set collectively agreed norms for how bishops should behave. These were very important events, which happened very often, and they shaped a good deal of medieval culture. The written decisions which were taken at these councils tell us a huge amount about medieval society, and in many cases, of course, influenced the law. But the written texts associated with these councils are not, in fact, the only texts that are associated with them. So there's other kinds of writing. And from the 7th century, there emerged special and bespoke liturgies for organising and choreographing the running of these councils. So essentially, these are mostly lists of prayers and of sermons and things like that. Okay, so the kind of how the council should run on a very practical level. These liturgies were first developed in Visigothic Spain, in fact, But they subsequently spread very much more widely than that and survive in literally hundreds of manuscripts from all across Europe in numerous different versions as well. So there are many different versions of these, but nearly all of them contain a prayer, which I think we can only really describe as an anti-corruption measure. It's a prayer to the Holy Spirit, which runs as follows. You have it, in fact, in Latin in front of you, but let me give you an English translation. Do not let us be disturbers of justice, you who love equity most of all, so that ignorance does not drag us to the left, nor does favour bend us, nor does the taking of gifts or the taking of persons corrupt us. Just a little later, in the same liturgy for the church council, there is an exhortation, there is an address to everybody who is present, which runs as follows. And again, you have the Latin on the screen, and here is an English translation. Next, with a similar exhortation, I demand of you that none of you in judging should take account of persons or depart from the truth because of some favour or gift. Yeah, munus is the Latin you see there, munere. It is possible that both these texts, the prayer and the exhortation, were written by Bishop Isidore of Seville, who died in 636, and they were both wildly successful. For the next half a millennium, almost every church council in Western Europe would have featured a version of this prayer and this exhortation. So every bishop who attends these councils, these synods, all his clerical attendants would have knelt and prostrated themselves in prayer many times, listening to these words being read out. It's worth pausing, I think, to consider the semantic field of these short statements, which I suppose we can also see as little 7th century clerical definitions of judicial corruption. We see here the Latin verb corrumpere associated with bribery. We also see reference to favours, and we see taking into account personal status. And I'll come back to that point later, by the way. So those attending these councils would have been left in no doubt that corruption was unacceptable, that judicial decisions should be swayed by neither favour nor gift, nor by someone's personal status. So this prayer is, I think, clearly an important part of the history of corruption. And yet, to my knowledge, it has never been studied as such. At least I'm not aware of any such studies. I think because it relates to the church and not the state. Now, the prayer and the statement talk about corruption and bribery and favours, but maybe the most interesting thing here is taking account of persons. So the Latin is acceptio personae, or sometimes acceptio personarum. So this is, as you probably know, a biblical phrase, which goes back to the Old Testament, the book of Deuteronomy, and then again in several points in the New Testament. The meaning of the original Hebrew here is actually a bit obscure, but the underlying point elaborated by St. Paul is of divine impartiality. God judges people purely on their merits, not on their persona, not on their public standing or their representation, literally their mask. Earthly judges should follow this model, and someone's public standing should not be taken into account. You should always judge the case and not the person. Now, Isidore of Seville, who wrote these prayers, probably, we know, was also very interested in this concept of acceptio personarum. He included it in his Sentences, a work of moral theology, which was very successful, again, with hundreds of manuscripts, which are still surviving. And in this work, called the Sentences, he devotes a whole section, a short section, to acceptio personarum. And again, you have the Latin in front of you, but the English runs, the person should not be considered in the judgment, but only the case. The one who perverts his judgment out of favour to family or friendship, or out of hatred to his enemies, without doubt is known to sin against Christ, who is truth and justice. Wicked judges err in the truthfulness of their judgment when they pay attention to the quality of the person. Now, this is a concept which will become quite important later, and which is being put in the same category as accepting bribes or doing favours or seeking revenge. This is also an abuse of power, abuse in fact of entrusted power. What's especially interesting about it is that, again, as far as I know, this was not a sentiment that can be found in Roman law. Now, Roman law, of course, insisted the judge should be neutral and should not accept bribes, but the Romans had no hesitation in judging people according to their status. not just between free and unfree, of course, but more significantly between honestiores and humiliores. And that's more significant because the point about free and unfree are about excluding the unfree from the justice system altogether. Whereas the distinction between honestiores, the more wealthy people, and the humiliores, the less important people, that was a distinction inside the law. There was no classical equivalent then for Isidore's prohibition of acceptio personarum, which comes actually from his reading of scripture. And in this way, I think we can see an interesting conceptual innovation in thinking about corruption, which emerges in a theological context. This brings us back to simony. One of the points that makes simony of interest for thinking about corruption, I think anyway, is how it represents the development of a specific vocabulary for the abuse of entrusted power from the 6th century onwards. There might not have been a specific word for bribe in the Middle Ages, and corruptio and corrumpere, these Latin words always retain quite a broad semantic field, in fact, so they could always mean many different things. But what there was a specific word for somebody who illicitly bought or sold a position in the church. And in fact, from the 11th century, there emerged an abstract noun specifically for this purpose, simonia, meaning simony. So we see here a language for talking about corruption, a specific language, which, some people say wasn't present in the Middle Ages. And I think maybe they're not looking for it in the right place. But I think the point goes further than that. Thinking about simony was also a way of thinking about office and of making arguments about the rightful use of entrusted power. Power entrusted here, of course, not by the state, but by God. And these go beyond banal statements that simony is bad. Let me give you a few examples of this. And my first one comes from a text which is not very well known today, if I can make work, there we go, called the De Dignitate Sacerdotali, or in English, On Sacerdotal Dignity. It's not very well known because there's some uncertainty as to who wrote it and in fact when it was written. It's often attributed to Gerbert of Aurillac, the Pope of the year 1000, but actually it's certainly older than that because it survives in some 9th century manuscripts. So it could be Carolingian actually, or it could be late antique. We don't really know, at least there's no certainty yet. Anyway, whatever it's dated, is very widely distributed, and again, there are dozens of manuscripts of this work. It's chiefly a text, as its title suggests, about the importance of episcopal office, but it also has some very interesting things to say about simony. The anonymous author complains that people are now buying episcopal office with cash, with pecunia, and they're infecting the body of the church. But he also represents the defense of the simoniac, who says this, and this is the Latin in front of you. I was recently ordained bishop by the archbishop, and I gave him 100 solidi to get the episcopal grace, episcopalem gratiam. If I had not given that, I would not be a bishop today. I gave the money and I bought the bishopric, but I am confident that if I live, I will get the money back. I ordain priests, I consecrate deacons, I take gold, and I expect to profit in cash from other orders too. See, look, the gold I gave away is now back in my treasure chest. Therefore I took the bishopric freely. Was this argument genuinely made? Did anyone really say this? This might seem unlikely, since to modern eyes, this seems very unconvincing, and certainly the author of De Dignitate Sacerdotali, the anonymous author, has no patience with this argument at all. And it might have been invented to show how episcopal simony embeds simony right through the church. But I think we might take this defense a bit more seriously if we consider that it's making a point really about the circulation and exchange of favours as part of the natural social cycle, viewing the acquisition of episcopal office as a one-off purchase was, we might imagine the simoniac saying, taking it a bit out of context really. And anyway, he didn't really have a choice. But actually for us, I think, whether or not this is a genuine argument is maybe besides the point. What is more interesting is how simony is serving in this early medieval text, or maybe late antique text, as a platform for thinking about what office was, what entrusted power was, and how it should properly be acquired. And that consideration involved inventing or maybe recording counter-arguments, not just endlessly restating norms. And these arguments continue in interesting and I think quite productive ways. In the late 11th century, around 1090 or so, the German scholar monk Bernold of Constance dealt with an interesting question, and the question was this: is it simony to buy and sell appointment to a church for a priest? Bernold explained that this had never been an issue in the ancient church because in the ancient church, priests were always ordained to a particular church, just like bishops were. And then there had been no distinction in the canon law tradition about buying an office and buying a church because they came at the same time. So that's why he says there is no explicit canon law forbidding this, a priest from buying a church to serve him. Now, though, Bernold says, well, now ordination to priesthood and appointment to a church are often different, often take place at different times. So this creates a new situation and uncertainty as to whether this counts as an abuse or not. Contrary to what his correspondent wanted to hear, Bernold says, yes, this is simony. To buy, you can be ordained freely, but then if you buy a appointment to a church as a priest, that is just as simoniac as paying for an office. So we see here contemporaries wrestling with how old norms might be updated to new circumstances. Later in the 12th century, these debates about simony go even further, and they're even further developed by scholars such as Peter the Chanter, the scholar at the University of Paris. Peter's very long and rather technical discussion of simony covers a whole range of possible events and occasions. Is it simony to buy relics? No, says Peter, not if you're taking them to a better place. Is it simony to pay clerics to sing acclamations, to sing laudes for a bishop or or for a king, for that matter? Because you're paying for a kind of religious service, I suppose. Yes, says Peter, if it's inside a church. If it's outside a church, it's fine. If you have a particularly irritating colleague, a clerical colleague who is insolent and intolerable and everybody hates him, is it simony to pay for him to go on pilgrimage to Jerusalem on the understanding he'll resign? No, says Peter, that's fine. As long as he is doing it for the right reasons himself, you can get rid of him in that way. What about paying a priest to do a marriage ceremony to kind of speed it up for whatever reason, if you want to, or at an unusual time of year? No, you're not allowed to do that, says Peter. I could go on, and Peter the Chanter does go on for quite a long time. But what's interesting here is just how simony is being used as a way of thinking about office centuries before similar precision of thinking is being reached in secular contexts. And as I said, these are discussions about the abuse. What is the abuse, in fact, of entrusted power, even if in this context, the origin of that entrusted power is not public authority, but, as I've said before, ultimately God. Now, these ideas about corruption in the religious sphere are of interest in their own right, and I don't think they need a secular context to be validated. They are interesting. But I think we're also entitled to ask whether there is any evidence for whether, with this thinking about abuse of office maybe crossed over into the secular realm, is thinking about clerical corruption contagious, so to speak? And the answer is yes, sometimes it is. As of course we might expect to see in a social context where the church in a way dominates the public sphere. We can sometimes see how ideas originally developed in clerical contexts are later applied to secular ones. I've already mentioned the notion of acceptio personarum, and how this was developed first of all in a Christian ecclesiastical context, but though it was developed in that context, it did not stay there. It made its way into Carolingian royal capitularies, as recently studied by Jan van Doren in this context, and it made its way into Angevin legal edicts. In fact, the notion of not respecting persons is part of the modern American legal tradition to this day. Judges in America today, and secular judges, I mean, are required to take on oath that they will not do it. I, the new judge, do solemnly swear or affirm that I will administer justice without respect to persons. So that is acceptio personarum appearing there. And to equal rights of rich and poor, and so on and so forth. Isidore of Seville would have loved this. He would have been absolutely very approving of this. Ideas of simony spread too. The election of kings could be seen as potentially simoniac, as was the case in 1077, according to a contemporary writer named Bruno of Mersburg, when he says papal legates warned the German aristocrats against demanding favours from candidates for the kingship before supporting them. He says, no, you can't. They say, no, you can't do that. That's kind of simony. Even secular judges could find themselves assessed through a Simoniac lens. As Peter the Chanter put it in a text aimed at royal judges, not church ones, to sell a judgment, even if you're penniless, even if you have no money, is simoniacal, because a judgment is connected to the office of judge and therefore to justice. Maybe most revealing of all, though, was an attempt in late Ottonian Italy, so this is late 10th century, to impose norms of clerical celibacy on secular judgments to try to stop them being swayed in their judgment by kinship relations, which I've written about in another context with Georgia Vicino. The text runs as follows. You have the Latin again on the slide, but it's called On the Life and Continence of Judges. And it says, moreover, English translation, it is permitted to none of our judges giving the law in the sacred palace, this is a secular context, that's what the Ottonian rulers called their palace, or elsewhere in our kingdoms, to contract a marriage. This is so that they should not be led by love of their children to leave the path of truth and law and to unjustly seize other people's property for the ambition of their children, ambitione filiorum, ambition of their children, using their judgments for their advantage. But despising the delight of this wicked world, they should hold the norm of truth in all occasions, in customs, our power on the signs of goodness, and as we've determined above in another chapter, they should imitate the religious priests and adhere in all things to their laws. So you will see in this text there is no reference to the Latin term corruptio, but clearly this is the conceptual field this text is intervening in this case using judicial power for the advantage of one's family. Now, it is unclear and probably unlikely how far and whether this suggestion that secular judges should be made to be celibate, to be unmarried, was this really ever seriously proposed, and certainly there is no evidence for it ever being implemented. But it's still, I think, a significant indication of how clerical norms and practices surrounding ideas of impartiality could sometimes cross over to other spheres. In this case, how the distinctly clerical idea that celibacy was a good solution for the distorting effects of kinship could spring to mind maybe as working for secular judges too. And we see maybe that office holding in the royal and clerical spheres were not so far apart. Okay, let me come to a conclusion, which I have 3 points. Firstly, the obvious one. There was a lot of discussion around corruption in the Middle Ages. Some of it used the specific terminology of corruption, corrumpere and so forth. Some of it didn't. And that's interesting. I think terminology is an interesting and important path of the inquiry for us to take. What words do people use to describe the phenomenon they're talking about? Some of this discussion took place in contexts that are familiar to us today, in discussions about corruption. And here I mean in particular around secular judges. Quite a lot of it, though, took place in a religious context, notably in the case of Simony. Modern discussions often play down corruption in the Middle Ages because they are so key to the idea of corruption as the abuse of public office understood in secular terms, and which is often assumed, wrongly, to be a feature of modernity. But researchers of corruption have recently begun to frame corruption not just as the abuse of public power, but actually as the abuse of entrusted power. And I think they do so partly now to allow for the possibility of corruption in the private sphere, within companies and corporations. But this approach actually, I think, has a lot of potential also for the Middle Ages, where we can see power being entrusted by lots of entities which are not the state, including the church. And maybe I would say especially the church. So that's the second point. And my third point is this, that if we do bring clerical corruption back into the picture, then we may need to challenge some of the widely held ideas about the history of corruption, including the assumption of an intensification of the discourse around it after the Middle Ages. Even if our focus is on secular office holding, we still need to make space for the deeper religious history of these notions, such as the concept of acceptio personarum, respects of persons. In beginning his book in 1600, Mark Knight was suggesting his audience, and his imagined audience was historians, but actually also social scientists. And he imagines they are very focused on modernity. He's beginning his book in 1600 to try to tell them the history of corruption was older than they think. They need to go back further than they think. I suggest, and I think this conference will help to demonstrate, that actually the history needs to be taken back a long way back before 1600 as well. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm very happy to take questions now, but please do feel free to email me as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor West, for this fantastic lecture full of examples that allow us to think about the need to think about the problem from different angles. That's exactly what we wanted when we invited you. So thank you very much. So let's see if we have some questions from our audience. Feel free. Professor West kindly accepts to answer some 2 or 3 questions.
Well, I will try anyway.
Okay. Isabella, please go ahead.
Hello, good morning. I want to ask, can you hear me well, all of you?
Yes.
Is my audio okay? Okay, so first of all, I would like to thank Professor Charles West for this conference. It was so interesting and so rich. And while I was hearing it, I became a little bit more curious on how do you, Professor, how do you see the cases in which there is a clear, I would say, ambiguity towards simony. For example, in the early Middle Ages. I was thinking, for example, in a case in which I read in the Lives of the Fathers of Merida, in the source from Visigothic Spain. So the author of the source, and if I am not wrong, it is, we don't know who was the author, but he says that by the end of the 7th century, I guess, or at least the source was produced by this time, he says that Bishop Paul from Merida, Bishop Paul, he received many, many gifts because of his actions to save the life from a woman from aristocracy. And he say he received many gifts from this couple from the elite, and he wanted his successor in this function as the Bishop of Merida to be his nephew. I think his name is Fidel. And he establishes a condition for that. He cannot decide that alone, but he makes Fidel his successor, and he establishes that if the clergy of Merida accepts Fidel, then all of his possessions, which will also be Fidel's possessions, will be transmitted, will be given to Merida, to the Church of Merida. And to the author, in the author's perspective, that is okay. And if I am not wrong, he says that, oh, there may be some people who will complain about this, but this is like such a great act of generosity. This is so good for the Church of Merida, so we cannot criticize this. So how do you see these situations, these examples of, I would say, ambiguity? In your point of view, how can we interpret these sort of situations? Okay, I guess this is my question. And sorry for my English. I know it's a little bit confused.
Isabella, thank you very much. That was a very clear question. I understood it perfectly, and thank you actually for introducing me. I know the text, but I had forgotten or didn't know there was such a lovely example there of in the Lives of the Fathers of Merida. So I'll have to go back and I'll have to go and look that up after this. Thank you very much. So I think what I would say about this, of course, is that I suppose there's 2 points here, and one is that it is actually the church as an institution in this world can never be fully extricated, can never be fully taken out of the networks of exchange and flow of money which are required ultimately for it to exist. So there is always going to be some level of exchange which can be interpreted or not, as you say, as simony. One thing which does change, though, is the extent to which intention counts. So the intention of the author, and this is something which is discussed quite well, really throughout, I think, throughout the Middle Ages, is how far, if you're doing it for a good reason, maybe it's okay. And there are some interesting 11th century defences along those lines. There's a lovely one from the very end of the 11th century where a bishop says, it's okay for me to buy the office because I'm going to do a good job. If I think the example he uses is if a shepherd has to buy his staff to chase away the wolves, doesn't matter if, you know, as opposed to someone gives it to him, as long as he beats the wolves, he's doing his job. So what changes actually is that for certain categories of action, intentionality stops mattering, and in particular for acquiring bishoprics and things like that, those are just ruled out of the question altogether. But at other levels, such as buying lesser church offices, especially when they're not ordained, it's still legitimate to ask, yeah, this might be okay if they're doing it for the right reason. So I guess I would say, you know, it's a question, there is always fundamentally an ambiguity. Quite a lot of that ambiguity revolves around intentionality. That never goes away, really. There is greater sensitivity in some contexts, I think, and in some circumstances, the rules are drawn more tightly, but they're never fully clarified.
Thank you.
Another question? Sergio, please go ahead.
First of all, thank you very much, Professor West. It was indeed a very enlightening and very delighting presentation. Well, I have just one question, and I don't know if it is a correct understanding of mine, but if I understood it correctly, the definition, so to say, of corruption, or at least the concept that that emerges from your presentations, that corruption has to do with the abuse of entrusted power, not only public power, but church power or other kinds of power. And in this instance, I ask whether the abuse of power is always in your documentations considered to be corruption, or if there are instances in which there is abuse of power, but there is no corruption. Putting it in other terms, when the power is abused by violence or by incompetence, is that considered to be corruption, or the corruption part needs the exchange of gift, of money, of munere, to use the Latin term? So thank you very much once again, and I hope that it was clear.
Thank you very much, Serge, for that question. Again, very clear. Thank you. So again, I think I would say there are two answers to that question. And one is we can, of course, look at the semantic field of how people are defining corruption, or at least we can look at the semantic field of words associated with corruption and see what is included. And I guess I would go back there to my example in the church councils and think about how those prayers kind of talk about a particular set of connected influences which are being linked together in that way. And that's one way for us to kind of get at what the concept of how contemporaries would have thought themselves of corruption, okay, as in kind of as a constellation of associated concepts. Because I mean, the second point is that it is obviously very hard, isn't it, to tell. Sometimes texts will talk about violence, and they do a lot, without necessarily using terminology which we would see as corruption. I guess that's an interpretive choice which then comes back to us. So I suppose what I'm advocating for, on the one hand, we have to be clear that we are allowed to kind of look for something in the sources. We're allowed to set our own methodological agenda and say this is what we're looking for, but we can kind of prime that using contemporary definitions, I guess, is how I'd reach toward a conclusion. Because yes, absolutely, there is the sources are full, aren't they, of violence, and often unaccountable, and power can be abused in different ways, through mischief, through malevolence, all kinds of just for the sake of it, in fact, which I think we would not normally define as corruption, and I think they would not too, but I agree those are slightly separate points.
Thanks, Professor.
Another question from the audience. Okay, so I can profit a little bit from my position here. And Professor West, I know that your latest book, The Fall of Carolingian Kingdom, Lotharingia, has scandal as an important explanatory motor. In this sense, scandal plays a strong role in building the reputation of the corrupt. it is said on the resume of the book. In the case of the great divorce struggle of King Lothar, it will also be possible to understand the episodes from a perspective of corruption of the common good, for instance.
Thank you, Maria. Not least for mentioning that book, which indeed is just being published. So I'm thank you for bringing that up. And that was a quite separate project. So it's interesting now to kind of think about how these questions might connect up. And for those who don't yet know the story, this is about a Carolingian king who accuses his wife of terrible sexual misdeeds, and in order to try and get divorced. And of course, there is some language there of corruption in that text. She is said herself to be corrupted, in fact, by her secret deeds. So her body itself has been corrupted. Whether or not, yes, that language is used, that particular terminology is used elsewhere, I'd have to go and see. But I suppose this comes back to Sergio's question just now as well, which is that, in a sense, what are we trying to do when we are writing? Are we trying to uncover realities, or kind of make sense of things in the past in their own terms, or are we trying to contribute to a kind of the modern debate around corruption, I suppose? And in the latter sense, this is why I think entrusted power is interesting, because I think this is a concept which works for people in the modern period, and I think works for us as well. And I think this means it's quite useful for us. I think the sense in which there is a strong sense, I suppose, in which we can see corruption in the Lothar II case, but it's quite different, I think, from the more modern discussions around corruption.
Yeah, I was thinking about the role of scandal as a main piece to construct an accusation of corruption, for instance, not in the case of the Lothar divorce and so on, but for instance, in the cases of Simony, the role of scandal to label some situation of a corrupt situation.
Yeah, and this is, and I guess the point about the scandal, which is also the case in the Lothar situation as well, but it means you can't ignore it anymore, right? You need to take action. It's become urgent and and I guess to come back to Isabella's question, that ambiguity then becomes erased by the scandal. I think that's the point of the scandal. Then you can't just say, oh, we can. It forces action and it forces a decision, I suppose, is the point. So yes, and we can see ways in which people do try and stir up scandal. The example which springs to mind now is that way in which somebody circulated Bishop Cyril's letter, right? The letter where he tries to bribe the court. In itself, I think it wouldn't have been problematic, but once it's out in the open, once people are trying to tell everyone else about it, then that changes the nature of the changes the nature of the action.
Yeah, of course. Okay, thank you. So if nobody else has a question, and Professor West most kindly accepts to hear our questions and answer them. So Professor West, I think that we are able to tell you how much we appreciated your lecture, and so we would love to keep in touch if you want in the near future to exchange more ideas about this subject that is our main subject of research. So we hope to see you in the near future, and we are and maybe we are able to bring you to Brazil if you accept, of course.
That would be wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to you, Filomena, and also, of course, to Leandro. And it's been a very interesting occasion for me, and I hope you have a really good discussion over the next few days as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor West.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And we applaud you, of course. Okay. Bom, a todas e todos, muito obrigada pela presença de vocês nesta primeira sessão que abre, né, o nosso encontro. Eu quero saudar, estou vendo aqui na tela, o professor Fábio Faversani, creio que Marcelo Cândido também está aí na plateia, acho que o Renato também, Renato Viana Boy, né, também está. Vou abrir aqui a lista só para não esquecer aqui nenhum dos nossos queridos colegas, dizer a vocês que já tínhamos avisado em termos da nossa burocracia, digamos assim, né? O próprio Teams nos fornece a lista de presença, então, para aqueles que precisam de assinar a lista de presença, então não é necessário, o próprio sistema nos fornece, para depois a emissão do certificado, obviamente. Clarice levantou a mão, imagino que ela tem alguma coisa para dizer do ponto de vista da organização, talvez, não é isso? Eu, de toda forma, já me despeço agradecendo e dizendo o quanto estamos felizes de poder dar início a mais um encontro do De Corruptione, que, como vocês puderam ver, pela programação, está cheio de discussões que eu creio que vão ser muito frutíferas para o avanço das nossas pesquisas, de outras cronologias também, que não só a Idade Média, obviamente, porque esse é o nosso propósito, né? Então é isso. Clarice, por favor.
Não, era um aviso realmente bem técnico, mas eu queria falar só com o professor Marcelo e o Renato, ao final, se eles puderem ficar, só para avisar uma troca que a gente teve, para eles ficarem sabendo antes de saber na hora, eu acho melhor avisar antes.
Tá bom.
Sem problemas.
Ok, muito bem. Então, a todos e todos, nos revemos na sessão da tarde. A referência pobre, que começa às 2, não é isso? Está marcado. Então, e a primeira sessão de comunicações, que será coordenada pelo professor Marcelo Cândido, justamente. É isso. Boa tarde, então.
Boa tarde.
Eu vou parar a gravação.